On a bleak Gettysburg day, Abraham Lincoln ended his address with a promise that the torn nation could be reborn someday. Before Lincoln had made his speech, a great symbol of rebirth had already begun, the Transcontinental Railroad. This railroad was to be a rival of the great Egyptian pyramids. It was to be an engineering marvel as well as a nightmare. The Union Pacific began laying tracks in the 1860s, going westward from Omaha, and the Central Pacific did the same, but coming from Sacramento, heading eastward. They hoped that one day they would meet. The railroad was a representation of the nation's struggle to forge a pathway between the East and West. In 1859, Theodore Judah, also known as Crazy Judah, asked the California Assembly to consider financing a transcontinental railroad. Judah interested the Big Four in his ideas. The Big Four were Mark Hopkins, Collis P. Huntington, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker. In July of 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. This act licenses the Union Pacific Railroad Company to build a line from the east. It also supports the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Now the question was, who was going to build the railroad? Between the years of 1847 and 1854, more than 1.5 million Irish people immigrated to the United States. They were trying to escape the famine in their country. In the Union Pacific, the majority of the workers were Irish. Also, as the railroad was getting started, many Chinese began to come to the United States. The majority of the Central Pacific workers were Chinese. On October 26, 1863, the Central Pacific began laying tracks in Sacramento. In 1865, almost 2 years later, the Union Pacific started laying track. This was because of the Civil War. But once the war was over, the Union Pacific could get started. And finally, just as the railroad was doing well, silver was discovered in Nevada in 1865. Most of the white workers left the railroad to go and search for silver. Because there was a shortage of workers, Charles Crocker, the head of the working process for Central Pacific Railroad Company, went looking for a new workforce. He started to hire Chinese immigrants, and by the year 1869, over 11,000 railroad workers were Chinese. The Chinese were not able to become citizens, vote, testify in court, own property, and they were forced to live in certain parts of town. When they started working on the rails, the Chinese were discriminated. They endured long days. They usually worked 24 hours, 7 days a week. The Chinese were hardworking and dedicated, even though the white men working on the rails got paid $35 a week, plus room and board. But the Chinese only got $25 a week and had to pay for their own supplies. This dedication played an important role in the completion of the railroad. In April of 1869, Promontory Summit was chosen to be the meeting place of the eastern and western lines. Also, the Central Pacific was trying to break a record. They wanted to lay the most miles of track in one day. In a valiant effort, they broke the record. They laid 10 miles of track in one day. Then, on May 10, 1869, a historic event happened. The last spike was hammered into the ground, and the Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed. It was joined at Promontory Summit in Utah. The telegraph that was sent to both coasts simply said, "Done." The nation was finally linked by rail. No more long and dangerous rides through the Oregon Trail by covered wagon or lengthy voyages around the tip of South America by steamboat. Financier George Francis Train stated, "The Great Pacific Railway is commenced. Immigration will soon pour into these valleys. 10 millions of immigrants will settle in this golden land in 20 years. This is the grandest enterprise under God." This accomplishment changed America like none other. Some ways were good and some were not. The impact on the Native Americans was life-changing. By 1890, the Powder River Valley, a rich hunting ground, was lost. Treaties scattered the Native Americans to reservations. The buffalo herds that the Indians depended so dearly on had nearly been depleted. The buffalo were easy prey to hunters. The railroad also introduced the buffalo herds to American industrial production. They became a resource to be mined. Millions of buffalo fell to slaughter. Their hides were shipped along the rails to markets in the East. The Transcontinental Railroad is still transforming the world today. Today, there are not only rails above ground, but there are also rails below. There are subway systems throughout many states in America. Diesel trains' fuel is becoming cleaner and cleaner. The clean diesel fuel reduces emission and petroleum consumption. Not only that, but California is building a high-speed bullet train. A bullet train will go up to 220 miles per hour, and it will travel from San Francisco to LA in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Before the rail, travel from east to west was long and dangerous. The Transcontinental Railroad changed many lives and cultures. Work on the rails was hard, but it paid off. It inspired many people to make more railroads, and soon the whole country was devoured by rail. A plethora of immigrants moved out west, and thousands of towns were built along the railway. This truly did stand rival to the Great Egyptian Pyramids. It took 6 years to build, claiming the lives of over 2,000 men. What started as one shovel of earth became America's first transcontinental railroad.